In a rare moment of bipartisan unity, the US Senate last week passed a motion to consider legislation that would boost government efforts to address hate crimes against Asian Americans, which have surged nearly 150% over the past year. The 92-6 vote paves the way for lawmakers to discuss and pass the so-called COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which proposes appointing a Department of Justice official to speed up reviews of reported incidents during the coronavirus pandemic. The bill would also set out guidelines to prevent discriminatory language to describe the pandemic and data collection to better analyse and address the situation. But these are just the first baby steps. More crucial and elaborate measures are required to shed more light on the systematic racism and violence against Asian Americans that has largely been unscrutinised throughout the decades. Today we discuss with two experts and community leaders on what's needed to support this massive but underserviced demographic. We speak with Anita Gundanna, Co-Executive Director of the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families. We also connect with Ji-Yeon, Professor of History at Northwestern University. A very warm welcome to you both. Thank you, ladies, so much for joining us today. Well, to go into the questions, let's start with you, Dr. Gundanna. Now, this surge of anti-Asian hate crimes that you've been seeing in your country, it's been especially pronounced where you are right now in New York. It seems that authorities are moving to address this, but the discrimination and the violence seems to be continuing. How is the situation right now?
Well, you're right that New York has faced a lot of what's going on right now with the anti-Asian hate. We've actually seen a 933% increase in violence and hate-related bias incidents in New York City alone over the past year. And I think what our communities are facing right now is a real tangible fear and anxieties that have been really spiking right now. And it's just compounded with, the pandemic that is, a lot of New York City was the epicenter here for COVID-19. And so the communities right now are struggling here, our Asian American communities, especially those in this particular situation who are East Asian presenting communities in New York City.
And Dr. Gundanna, how has the surge of hatred and violence against Asian Americans affected the families that you work with, particularly school children and young people? In what ways are they particularly vulnerable to this?
Yeah, so we work with a lot of community organizations that are on the ground working with families and children. And the children here and their parents are worried about going out, about leaving their homes. And so, at this point, we know of many families who don't want their children to leave, who don't want their children to go out and engage in activities that they would have otherwise engaged in. We're also seeing here a phenomenon that where Asian Americans are largely also engaging in remote learning, even when there are options for hybrid learning or in-person learning. And so, we don't know exactly all the linkages, but it could potentially be related also partly to all the fears going on.
And it's such a shame because New York is supposed to be one of the most diverse, multicultural places on the planet. And, well, Dr. Yeon, America's history as a nation, it is rather short. And during that time, it's grown to be a country of newcomers united in one gigantic melting pot. But why are there such divisions of ethnicities and that sense of othering of East Asians in particular? It seems they're being targeted not only by white Americans, but other racial groups as well. How have they become the easy targets?
Yes. So, Asian Americans and Asian immigrants have not really been included in the idea of America as a land of immigrants. For as long as America has been a country, Asian immigrants have been seen as, and Asian Americans have been seen as foreigners, perpetual foreigners. Additionally, since the 1960s, Asian Americans have been stereotyped as the quote-unquote model minority, meaning they are successful, but also compliant. And so the model minority myth labels Asian Americans as complicit with white Americans against other Americans of color, while the perpetual foreigner stereotype labels them as not American, even as un-American. And so together, these two stereotypes position Asian Americans as targets for bullying, harassment, and violence from not only whites, but also other people of color. And I'd like to note that Asian Americans have been experiencing racist violence for centuries, including massacres and lynchings. So the recent violence against Asian Americans is not a new phenomenon. Anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence in the United States is a problem with a history as long as the history of the nation.
And model minority, that's rather patronizing, isn't it? And well, there's all this history behind this racism, but even when you look at contemporary times right now, there doesn't seem to be enough data on this or any sort of statistics. But Dr. Your recent research by one organization has revealed that nearly 3,800 incidents were reported over the course of roughly a year during the pandemic, and nearly 7 out of 10 cases, the victims were women. Why are women particularly vulnerable to the surge of violence?
Well, racial violence is a cowardly act, by which I mean people who make racially motivated attacks are not looking for a fair fight or even for a fight at all. They are looking for victims. And due to sexism and racism, Asian American women are often seen as victims. In addition, Asian American elderly have also been disproportionately targeted by this recent, surge in anti-Asian violence, and it's because, in part, the elderly are also seen as victims. But I also want to say that, Asian American community organizations have been trying to track anti-Asian violence since at least the 1960s or 70s. It's just that it's really hard to do because police departments don't track this, governments don't track this, and so therefore community organizations are reliant on self-reporting. And as you know, that is sort of a spotty kind of data gathering.
Right, not enough federal backing, no support from local governments either on gathering this very important information. And well, Dr. Gundanna, you've been at the forefront of really pushing for proper sort of data collection. And in terms of data on hate crimes or other national statistics that are very important, it seems Asian Americans are largely omitted, or they come with side notes and asterisks saying that enough people that haven't been enough people who participated in this, or they're completely omitted from those kind of statistics. You've been, of course, campaigning for proper data disaggregation. How has the lack of proper representation in numbers and stats really affected the social security and welfare of Asian Americans?
Yeah, so the lack of data is really debilitating for our communities. And even when the data is there, it's dangerous because it may misrepresent our communities. So Asian Americans are very, very diverse. And it's very hard to capture a number for Asian American and for it to be very meaningful, to show the struggles, the challenges, the needs, or even the successes in our community. And so if we're trying to, and you're right to say that New York City is so diverse, if we're trying to capture South Asians, Southeast Asians, East Asians, even Central Asians into this one lump term, it really does wash out the various complexities within our communities. So what we've been fighting for at the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families for so long is for accurate representation of our communities. And this is really important because, the stereotypes that of the model minority, of the perpetual foreigner, those have all lended themselves to create this invisibility of our communities and perpetuate this invisibility. The model minority was created in the 60s when actually a lot of Asian Americans were starting to join in civil rights and movements and stand in solidarity across communities of color. And it has done such a disservice to our community, not only to hide our struggles and real challenges that some of our children and families face, but also to pit us against other communities of color. And so not enabling us to really work in collaboration when we can and should be working together to really meet the needs of all of those who struggle the most. So, coming together and actually advocating for better data has been one of our tactics here in New York, and it's actually starting to work. So people are listening to us, and it's not just Asian Americans talking about better data, and it's a lot of folks who are working together to acknowledge the need to really highlight what's going on. I think one example is in COVID-19. We were also erased out of the data. There was a lot of focus on other communities who are disproportionately impacted. But we're now finding that Chinese Americans had highest death rates in New York City of all across all racial ethnic groups for COVID-19, or South Asian Americans had high hospitalization rates. And these cannot be identified unless we collect better data.
And Dr. Yeon, now many say that the recent wave of anti-Asian violence and harassment, a lot of it has been attributed to the rhetoric of your former President Donald Trump last year throughout the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. How much power does language have on discrimination and really inciting this racism?
Well, language certainly has a great deal of power, and Trump used his position to make white nationalism and white supremacy acceptable. But he is not really the problem. The problem is that racism has been a potent force in the United States from the beginning of its history, and it only takes a demagogue or two, like Trump, to bring it out into the open. But even when it's in the shadows, it's still happening. So, for example, in the past few decades, under presidents much less openly racist than Trump, Asian Americans have been murdered, attacked, bullied, and harassed for their race. Right? And I'll just give a couple of examples. 1982, Chinese American Vincent Chin is murdered just before his wedding because laid off Detroit auto workers thought he was Japanese, and they blamed Japan for being laid off. Late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, a gang calling themselves the Dot Busters targeted South Asian American women, attacked them and harassed them. In Philadelphia in the 1990s, a wave of youth violence swept through the city, and it was white youth against Asian Americans. In New York, and this is still a problem, there are multiple incidents of people being pushed into the subway. In almost all cases, those people are Asian American, right? Also, the shooting in Atlanta last month was not the first mass shooting of Asian Americans. In 1989, a white male gunman opened fire on a schoolyard in Stockton, California. He killed 5 or 6 Asian American children and injured another 29 or 30. And his reason? He felt that that school had too many Southeast Asian families in it, that it was no longer a white school that he had been accustomed to. That was an incident of anti-Asian violence. It's only because the nation is now paying attention that we think that there is a rise in violence. Well, most Asian American studies scholars actually say it's not a rise, it's merely increased visibility.
And well, hopefully though, this will lead to change, hopefully and finally. And well, lawmakers have been trying to push this COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act through. And Dr. Yeon, would you be optimistic about that? What developments would you most like to see to really overcome this ongoing environment of hate speech and just terrible hate crimes against Asian Americans?
Unfortunately, additional legislation and policing is not likely to prevent anti-Asian violence. Those kinds of measures deal with the racist violence only after it happens. We need to prevent it. And that means changing societal norms so that Asian Americans are generally seen as fellow Americans so that anti-Asian racism of all kinds is not acceptable. And we can do that by hiring and supporting Asian Americans to be teachers, artists, legislators, etc., and by promoting them to positions of leadership. We can do that by teaching everyone how to identify anti-Asian racism, including speech, and how to speak up in a way that educates and gets people thinking in more equitable ways. In other words, we need people's way of thinking and way of living and way of interacting to change. Crime legislation and more policing is not really the answer.
Well, I know that both of you, as both academics and social leaders, you've been really pushing for this kind of leadership and capacity building in Asian communities in your country. And well, I'm afraid we're out of time today, so this is where we'll have to end the interview. But that was Anita Gundanna, Co-Executive Director of the Coalition for Asian American Children and Families, and Ji-Yeon, Professor of History at Northwestern University. Thank you again so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.